Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell, Florida State, starting to make some noise as it pertains to the spring transfer portal window. Former Houston cornerback Jeremiah Wilson committing to Florida State. Now, the Florida State fans who've been rocking with the fellas the last couple of days, we've talked about this kid. Y'all know how I feel about Jeremiah Wilson. It's about as good as it gets in terms of cornerback options that we've seen pop into the transfer portal. Clearly was the best cornerback available in the spring. I think you could take this back to the winter. So yeah, this is one of the better cornerbacks that we saw in the country in the 2024 season. A guy that, look, there's no projecting when you're talking about Jeremiah Wilson. We've seen for the last couple of years that he is one of the top cornerbacks in the country heading into 2025. And although he does not have this really flashy athletic profile, he's 5'10, 185, ran, I believe, an 11.3 in the 100-meter dash coming out of high school. This kid can just play. He can play in man, can play in zone, has tremendous feel for the cornerback position, routinely gets into passing lanes, gets his hands on the football. You know you're getting a good football player. And that's been something that this new staff with Mike Norvell, they valued these kind of players. We're not going after the guys like Malik Benson, who haven't really contributed at college but have some high potential. We're going out and getting really good football players that we know can come in and play at a high level. The second thing that stands out to me about Jeremiah Wilson is this kid, he wants to be here. You look at the interviews, he's from Florida, was kind of an under the radar guy coming out of high school. There are a lot of transfer portal additions that we've seen teams make, and we've seen Florida State make. Go back to 12 months ago, there were a lot of guys that were coming into the Florida State program that you weren't really sure how much they wanted to be there from the portal. It felt like it was maybe just a little bit of a transactional move. Like, you talk to Jeremiah Wilson or you listen to Jeremiah Wilson talk is probably the better way of putting it. This kid wants to be in Tallahassee. Like, this kid wants to play for Florida State. That's something that, maybe Florida State didn't have enough of in 2024. You're getting it with Jeremiah Wilson, and it kind of goes back to how we've talked about this program in the transfer portal this offseason in general. There's a little bit more of a vetting process. There's a little bit more of, hey, picking and choosing guys that, look, not only are good football players, but are going to come in and be good members of this Florida State program as well. And Jeremiah Wilson, plug and play boundary cornerback that allows you to do a lot of different things with this kid. Can play press man coverage, can play some off zone, like a lot of different things you can do. This one makes a lot of sense. Now, want to get into a couple more storylines that have kind of emerged for Florida State in the portal, talk a little bit more about Jeremiah Wilson. Before we get into it, as always, the Florida State fans, appreciate you guys. It been a busy last couple of weeks, tracking all the new faces in spring practice, getting acquainted with some of the spring transfer portal targets, you might say. Florida State fans, y'all shown a ton of support to the fellas. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this one. Now, here's another thing that I'll note about the Jeremiah Wilson edition. The new staff that Mike Norvell has hired, in my opinion, kind of flexing their muscles. Tony White's a really good defensive coordinator, but he's also shown that he's a very, very good recruiter. That was something that was not good enough for Florida State during the old staff with, the staff that we saw in 2024. Like, I'm not sure how many coaches really loved the recruiting process and really wanted to go out there and really push the envelope. And look, quite frankly, if you're coaching college football that does not want to make it happen on the recruiting trail, you probably should go coach in the NFL because it is a massive part of the game. And it felt like the old staff under Mike Norvell just, for lack of better terms, like, didn't want it that badly. You start reading some of the stories of this Jeremiah Wilson recruitment, it was pops into the portal. Florida State identifies him as a target. They get him on campus. They have almost every staff member in the building calling this kid getting. That's what it needs to look like at a premier program like Florida State. Like, you want to compete with teams like Georgia, in Alabama for some of the best prospects in the country. Yes, NIL matters. We certainly know that. You still have to recruit your tail off. The old staff probably wasn't doing a good enough job about that. This new staff feels a little bit different in terms of how they go about their business on the recruiting trail, which I think is a really big storyline. Now, getting into Jeremiah Wilson really quick, just want to buzz through some of the PFF numbers. And I'll say this, over watching Jeremiah Wilson over the last couple of days, the film matches the PFF numbers. I like to use PFF as a, more of a tool to kind of find some players that are intriguing, but you want to go turn on some of their tape and kind of understand, all right, are they actually good football players too? Yeah, Jeremiah Wilson is. I mean, you look at the numbers from 2024, 38 targets, only gave up 17 catches. That's a 44% completion percentage when targeted. Only committed one penalty in coverage, which I think's fascinating because you look at a lot of these really, really good boundary cornerbacks that have those really low completion percentages when targeted. You normally see a decent amount of penalties. Jeremiah Wilson, not many penalties in terms of what he does in coverage. Only misses 7% of his tackles. So you're getting a cornerback that you take a look at, all right, what are all the boxes that we want to check? One, we want a versatile cornerback. A guy that, especially in the Tony White defense, can play man, can play zone. Jeremiah Wilson can do that. Can you be an elite guy that you can be put on an island? Because that's another important thing with this Tony White defense. Hey, we know Tony White wants to bring some pressure packages. Well, when you bring pressure packages, you have to leave your cornerbacks out there on islands. So like Jeremiah Wilson can do that. And he's a guy that tackles in space. He's pretty much checking off all the boxes that you want to see for a boundary cornerback. And I think what's intriguing now is that I think you kind of got your secondary set. I mean, you got a rotation of 3 boundary cornerbacks, Jeremiah Wilson, Quindarius Jones, and Jabril Rawls, who I think Florida State has a lot of confidence in all 3 of those guys going into 2025. Now, you have some guys like Kai Bates and Charles Lester who kind of coming up the pipeline, but you kind of got your cornerback rotation heading into 2025. You've heard some really good things about the safety position. You start looking at, all right, what else does Florida State need? One of the takeaways that I had out of spring was I think Florida State is really happy with the transfer portal additions that they made in the offseason in the winter. Like that defensive line, I haven't seen Florida State go after a single defensive lineman. And that's telling me, hey, we feel like we hit on a lot of those additions, guys like Deonta McCray, DeMonte Diggs, James Williams. The linebacker position is another interesting one to monitor because it's, on paper, a Florida State fan might have some question marks about it. That's another position that Florida State hasn't really pursued in the spring portal window. And, we heard good things from Omar Graham and Elijah Herring. And I'll say this, it's one thing to hear good things about him in spring practice. It's another thing for the staff to back up those words with, hey, we're not looking to replace these linebackers that we have coming out of spring. Now, if Florida State did want to grab one more linebacker, you had a name pop in late last night in Muhammad Torre, who, as a Big Ten guy, Michigan fan, I've watched this kid really dominate the Big Ten over the last couple of years. Now, Rutgers is not normally a powerhouse in the Big Ten, but they've had this mothball linebacker that's played some really good football over the last couple of years. Late edition, we know Florida State has some bullets in the chamber because they haven't really gone out and landed 5-10 guys in the portal. Interested to see if Florida State becomes a player for Muhammad Torre, who missed the whole entire 2024 season, but has been a staple at linebacker for Rutgers over the last couple of years. Probably going to add one more wide receiver, ideally one more depth piece on the offensive line. And I think Florida State's kind of ready to take this roster in a fall camp. Less, I don't know if I maybe used the word desperation from Florida State in the spring. Like it felt like last year there was like a lot of fires that this team tried to put out in the spring. That doesn't seem as much of the case for Florida State in the spring as well. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.